Ryan Parle from Bristol Astronomical Society, and it's So You Want a Telescope. Over to you, Ryan.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. You want a telescope? Throughout this talk, I hope to be able to give you some useful tips and information to guide you in choosing your first telescope. I'll give you a little bit about myself first before I get into the talk. My name is Ryan Parle. I'm the Vice Chair of Bristol Astronomical Society, and I have been a hobbyist astronomer since around 2008. Started out with visual observing, soon discovered that I was more interested in astrophotography. So I sort of invested in that mostly. A few years ago, I was quite lucky that I managed to turn my hobby into a kind of part-time profession when I worked for BBC on the Stargazing live show for Series 2 through to Series 6. And it was my job to provide live video feeds to be broadcast. I'm also a bit of a hardware geek. I love fancy telescopes and equipment and all that. So yeah, when I can afford it, I'm always buying new stuff. So I kind of want to share a bit with you about now. I'm going to talk a little bit about the views you may see through your telescopes, the basics of the different telescopes that you may, the commonly available ones on the market, as well as the different types of mountings. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the specifications used to sort of define telescopes to enable people to get an idea of what they're buying. And finally, I'll give you some recommendations as to the type of telescope you may want for certain uses. They're more of a set of tools than absolute recommendations. I'm not going to say go and buy this particular brand and model of telescope because it doesn't apply to everybody. So first off, don't believe the hype. There's many cheaper telescopes, especially those sold in camera shops and bigger toy stores, that sort of thing. And they've got these, they give you the impression you're going to see these amazing Hubble-like images through the telescope. Unfortunately, it isn't really the case. There's a reason we've got professional observatories, space telescopes, advanced camera gear and stuff attached to them. And that is because you just can't see those views with a hobbyist telescope, So yeah, you don't want to get caught up in that hype, really. The human eye is kind of limited, so that's a big reason. We use a telescope to kind of drag in more light, but the human eye will only really see in monochrome, in black and white, at those levels for a lot of astronomical targets. Some of these points may seem a little bit doom and gloom, but there are many great things that you can see. For example, the moon. The moon is absolutely magnificent. It's really, in my view, it's the first thing that you would want to point your telescope at. It will look good through almost any telescope that you buy, and you can get great views almost any magnification. A full disk of the moon a full disk of the moon at low magnification is brilliant. And then the more magnification you add, the more detail you begin to see every step. And there are hundreds of features to see, and different craters, etc., mountains. And because the terminator or the line of shadow moves across the moon throughout the lunar month, you'll get different views every time you look. Every night you look, a certain crater will look a little bit different as the way the light falls on it. With larger telescopes, you may notice subtle hints of color, but it's very limited. And of course, the moon is bright. You can often observe it in broad daylight, although in broad daylight your contrast is going to be somewhat limited. planets, they're another great one to. They can kind of pop out, especially the gas giants. They kind of really do stand out from their background. There's a good bit of color to be seen in them, and to be honest with you, most people, the first view they ever have of a planet will stick with them for life. It was seeing Saturn through a telescope when I was a child that first caught my interest in astronomy, and then some years later, I actually made the investment and took up astronomy. You know, looking at the stars, a quick look may lead you to believe that all the stars are white. But there is a surprising range of color visible. Betelgeuse is one. It's the shoulder of Orion, which has a distinct red color compared to many other stars in the sky. You know, it's obviously quite red. Through a telescope with reasonable magnification, it's possible to see distinct color differences between two stars of what we call double stars, where you've got two stars in very close proximity to each other. One of the most famous of those is Albireo in Cygnus, where you've got a very bright blue star and a very bright orange star next to it. Open clusters, for example, this image of M44, the beehive cluster, you see several yellow stars among a good field of blue stars. And some of the larger globular clusters, those that are a little bit closer to us, again, they tend to show a variety of color stars, but some of the smaller ones are a bit harder to detect due to their size. Again, nebulae, looking at nebulae, they are very faint. They're faint diffuse objects. They often look like just a fuzzy patch. Some people may think they see a hint of green. That's just the way your eyes work. It's not really what you're seeing. But because there's no color, it doesn't mean there's nothing interesting to see. With a decent telescope, you can really start to pick out some decent detail. This image I've got here is kind of analogous to what you may see with the eye through the telescope. It gives you a vague idea of what you'd expect to see. But you typically wouldn't look directly at it. You avert your vision. You look slightly away, and the rod receptors are more of your eye are more sensitive, and you start to pick out these fainter details. And then galaxies, another interesting target. Often visually unappealing because they're just a fuzzy patch, but the coolest thing about the galaxies is the fact they are so far away. That light that comes through to you may have taken many billions of years to eventually have found its way down through the telescope into your eye, and me personally, I find that's quite mind-blowing, you know. So yeah, we've covered a little bit about what you expect you may see through the telescope, and now I'm going to go on to talk about the telescope, the types of telescopes themselves, and some of the features and so on. So we've got three main types of telescopes: reflectors, refractors, and catadioptrics. And then each of those categories have got several variations. And also the boundaries between the reflectors and the catadioptrics are a little bit blurred because quite a few of them share some fairly common design features. There are also a series of specific telescopes. Andy mentioned his solar telescope. So they're dedicated obviously just for looking at the sun. And there are also telescopes you may see described as astrographs. These are usually designed specifically for photographic use. Some of them you can use for visual, but there's a bit of a compromise there. So next, we will move on to refractors. Refractors are the stereotypical telescope. When you think of someone using a telescope, you often imagine someone looking through a long tube. And that's the type of telescope we're looking at here. They use glass lenses to focus the light down a straight tube to another ends. which is an eyepiece at the back, which you look through. Small lenses are quite cheap to manufacture, so some of the cheapest telescopes on the market are refractors. They're not necessarily the best ones at that level, but they, you can get some very cheap ones out there. Large lenses are extremely expensive to manufacture, so refractors can also make some of the most expensive telescopes. Certainly not on the general commercial market, but when you get into professional big telescopes, yeah, some incredibly expensive stuff. Small to medium-sized refractors are most popular telescopes used. Although one issue with refractors is because you're passing light through a lens, different wavelengths of light or different colors of light reach focus at a different point. This can give you chromatic aberration or color fringing. You may notice in through some optics an orange sort of fringe on one side and a blue fringe on the other side. This can be resolved by the telescope manufacturer using more glass segments in the main lens, which will effectively allow all colors of light to come to focus at once. And 3 to 5 segments can be used. Those telescopes are known as triplets, quadruplets, or quintuplets, and that just refers to the number of lenses in the main lens cell. Next, we have reflectors. Reflectors use mirrors or a mirror or a series of mirrors to bounce light to a plane of focus. The most commonly used reflector is the Newtonian reflector, often called a newt. It was named after Isaac Newton, who kind of came up with the idea for them. Primary mirror, which is the large mirror towards the bottom end of the tube, usually has a parabolic profile. You may see some sold with a spherical mirror. They're generally to be avoided. They're not the best quality optics out there. Mirrors are much cheaper to produce than lenses, so as a result, they actually make the really good value for money. If you want aperture, if you want to be able to gather as much light as possible, a reflector is a good place to start. One of the minor drawbacks with reflectors is that the optics require alignment, or a process we call collimation, to make sure that the lenses the mirrors are all correctly aligned and you get the best view. It can be a little bit tricky to get your head around, but once you've got the hang of it, it becomes second nature, and you can do it in a matter of minutes. Then there are the Casta dioptric telescopes. These are kind of they use a combination of both lenses and mirrors, and they bounce the light back and forward a couple of times up the length of the tube, so they can achieve long focal lengths. Typically, the focal length is approximately 1/3. Sorry, the length of the tube is approximately 1/3 the focal length. I'll discuss focal length a little bit in a minute, but effectively, it's the amount of magnification that you would get through the telescope. Casta grain telescope is any telescope with a folded optical path, and the most popular types of Casta dioptric telescope are the Schmidt-Casta grain and the Max-Sutov Casta grain. Max are generally quite small, with apertures up to around 125 millimeters, and Schmidt-Casta grains tend to be slightly larger, with apertures of around 150 to 350 millimeters. They do, like their reflectors, they do require some collimation, but they are generally much more stable than Newtonians, and if handled with care, you may never need to make any corrections for casual observing. They do adjust the focus by moving the mirror up and down the tube. It can give you a huge range of focus available for some long optical trains. but as a side effect of moving the mirror can tilt slightly, causing some focus issues, which is known as mirror flop. Some manufacturers will provide a mechanism called a mirror lock to kind of reduce this. So we've kind of covered the basic telescope types, but we need something to put the telescope on. So there are a range of different mounts to support them, and they all kind of work on two different axis systems that we use. First, we have the alt-azimuth axis system, which is the simplest concept to get your head around. It is simply looking left and right and up and down. If you have a camera tripod with a pan and tilt head, it's more or less an alt-azimuth mount. One drawback of using an alt-azimuth mount is to follow the stars. You need to move the axes a bit at a time, each axis a bit at a time, so it can be a little bit fiddlier to track the stars. Another mount system, or the axis system we use, is known as the Equatorial System. It can seem a bit counterintuitive, but once you've got set up and you've got your head around it, it's a much more practical system. Here we align one axis to the same tilt as the rotation of the Earth. This axis is known as the right ascension axis, and by just moving the telescope through the right ascension axis, it allows us to follow the path that the stars will take across the sky. There's a second perpendicular axis known as declination. That's a kind of equivalent to the up and down axis of alt-azimuth mount. Many telescopes are sold with massive, great big optics and skinny, undersized mount, which can lead to a lot of frustration. Ask me how I know. I made the mistake of buying a big telescope on an undersized mount, and I found the startup very frustrating until I eventually bought a bigger mount. They're also often available with a range of drive. So some of them are just manual drive. Some of them have motors. Some of them are fully computer controlled, what we call go-to. We have a range of different sort of mounts. So the basic alt-azimuth mounts are very simple to operate. They're typically very sturdy and very light, easy to grab and go. They don't usually have motor drive options, but they often have hand wheels for precise sort of movements. Some are capable of carrying multiple telescopes, 1 or 2 telescopes, but as a beginner, you probably won't need to worry about that. They don't typically require balancing the telescope or anything like counterweights to help out. And they're typically suited to mounts of relatively short telescopes with relatively short optical tubes, such as refractors and Casta dioptrics. Some of them can support larger Newtonian telescopes as well. Another alt-azimuth style of mount is the Dobsonian mount, or known as Dob. It's a very simple design and one of the most popular DIY style mount designs on around there. Can be made, if you're into DIY, can be made with a few sheets of MDF or plywood, a little bit of Teflon and a couple nuts and bolts. It's almost exclusively used to carry Newtonian telescopes. Often Newtonian telescopes on a Dobsonian mount are sold as a Dobsonian telescope, although there's a little bit incorrect, but many years of marketing have caused that name to stick. They'd be more or less manual. You just push them around the sky to wherever you want to go. There have been a few sort of computerized add-ons for these mounts. They've never really gained popularity. Probably the easiest type of telescope type of telescope mount combination to set up. You literally plonk it on the floor and off you go. Just push it around to wherever you need to go. Generally, there's very little assembly to be done. There's no balancing or anything like that. It's just get on and go. German equatorial mount, most popular probably of the equatorial mount systems. Equatorial mounts require a little bit more setup. They need to be set level. They need to have the right ascension axis aligned with the Earth's axis. It's done with a process through we call polar alignment. There are multiple ways of doing this. The most simple is a polar scope, which looks up the right ascension axis, and looking through that, you can align up with Polaris, the North Star. Equatorial mounts also do require to be balanced, so that the motors don't have to work, or so everything is when you release the clutches to move the thing about, the telescope doesn't drop to the floor. There are versions of these mounts that are fully manual, versions with motorized drives and go-to functionality. If you're thinking of getting into astrophotography, you probably would want to invest in a go-to mount. One other drawback is that depending on the size of the optics you've got, at certain positions there is a chance that the telescope can collide with the tripod, so you do need to be aware of this and initialize a move called a Meridian Flip, which will basically reverse both axes and then move the telescope to a position where it's not going to collide with the mount. We have fork mounts. These are they can primarily be used in Azimuth, but they also typically, most of them have an equatorial mode by using a device called a wedge, which is an adjustable platform. It allows the base of the mount to be tilted so that the azimuth axis would now become the right ascension axis. Majority of the time they come pre-attached to Schmidt-Cassegrains or Maksutov-Cassegrain telescopes, although there are a handful of fork mounts that are not actually permanently attached. They nearly all use a go-to system as standard. There aren't many manual fork mounts on the market. Most of those have been kind of made obsolete. Typically you don't need to mess around in balancing them. They come well balanced. You may need to fine-tune the balancing if you're going to put a heavy eyepiece or a heavy camera on the back. They don't need to do a Meridian Flip. They can track uninterrupted from east to west. One restriction that there is that depending on the length of any accessories fitted in the back, they may collide with the base of the fork, so you do need to be careful when looking straight up or towards the pole, depending on which mode you're in. There are a range of other mounts, some of them sold as multi-purpose mounts, which are essentially German equatorial mounts, but they have a extended range in the polar alignment mechanisms, allowing them to be either used in altazimuth or in equatorial mode. There are also some mounts that again use the same physical kind of layout to the equatorial. They use a different kind of gearbox system called a harmonic drive. They provide a completely backlash-free operation. You don't need any counterweight or balancing, and they can handle really big payloads for their size. There's a few ultra lightweight mounts out there which are known as star trackers. They're typically designed for holding a DSLR and a camera lens or a small telescope. They typically only track around right ascension and have manual adjustment for the declination. I'm just realizing I'm getting quite a long way into this. I'm running out of time for questions. No. I will try and press on as much as
5
possible.
minutes.
If you sort of wind down a bit.
Yeah. So little bit on specification. Focal length is one of the main specs that you'll see for when you choose a telescope. That is effectively the amount of magnification. A high focal length telescope will give you a narrow field of view or more magnification, and vice versa. We have aperture. That is the size of the diameter of the telescope. The larger the aperture, the more light we gather. We have focal ratio, which is a ratio between the focal length and the aperture of the telescope. And we have magnification, which is basically a case of dividing the focal length of the telescope by the eyepiece's focal length, and that will give you the magnification in times. I will skip over accessories. I don't think we really need to talk about that. So some considerations and recommendations when choosing your telescopes. Think about where you're going to observe, how far it is from the storage location of the telescope. Can you carry a great big 12-inch Dobsonian telescope down the stairs if you live in a flat, for example? Are you motivated to learn your way around the night sky, to use star maps and manually work your way around? There are many objects that are easily found, but then the more you get into it, the harder these objects become to find. If this seems like too much effort for you, you might want to consider a go-to mount system. There's a bit more to getting started. The learning curve's a little bit steeper initially, but then once you've got your head around how to set up a go-to system, it will then point to any object in the night sky with a few button presses. Think about the particular field of astronomy that appeals to you. For example, certain telescopes are better for certain types of observation. Schmidt-Cassegrain telescopes typically make very good telescopes when looking at the planets. Refractors are great for wide field views. Your budget, buy the best telescope you can afford to buy within reason, but don't get carried away. There's no point in going out and buying the biggest, best telescope as your first purchase. I mentioned before about mount bundles, so try and make sure you get a decent match between the mount and telescope. The best telescope is the one you'll use. Think carefully about your choice before jumping in. Buying a big telescope to set up, if it's a lot of effort, it is most likely to just sit in the corner and never get used. If it's quick and easy to grab, you use it a lot more. My recommendations for good starting points. For visual use, I would say a 6-inch or 150mm Dobsonian is a great one to start with. If you're prepared to learn your way around the sky. If you want to go a bit lazy and go for a go-to mount, then I'd maybe suggest a refractor of around 80mm. If you can afford it, buy